Hello and welcome to this Constitution Unit seminar. My name is Alan Rennick. I'm the Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit and I'm your chair for today's seminar, the title of which is Changes and Challenges in Regulating Elections. As you all know, we're just a week away now from elections throughout England and Wales for mayors in most of the big metropolitan areas, for police and crime commissioners, and in many places also for local councils. In addition, of course, a UK general election must take place within the next 9 months. And all of these elections are taking place amidst a great deal of change to the electoral rules, changes including changes to the franchise, the introduction of voter ID requirements at polling stations, the new procedures around absentee votes, a shift from preferential voting for mayoral and PCC elections to first past the post, a sudden jump in general election campaign spending limits, which will be coming down the line later in the year, and much else as well. So exactly what has changed? What effects might these changes have? And what challenges do they present for parties, candidates, and election administrators? These questions are our focus for today, and to explore them, I'm delighted that we're joined by a really fantastic panel. Laura Locke is a very experienced election administrator, and as Deputy Chief Executive of the Association of Electoral Administrators, she is vastly knowledgeable about how electoral processes actually work on the ground, and she's also a very frequent voice of clarity in the media on election processes. Paul Tyler, Lord Tyler, was first elected to Parliament back in 1974. He moved to the House of Lords in 2005, where he spoke for the Liberal Democrats on constitutional matters until his retirement in 2021. And most recently, he co-authored with Nick Harvey the book, Can Parliament Take Back Control? Chapter 1 of which is all about elections, so all about our subject for today. And Alistair Clark is Professor of Political Science at Newcastle University, where his research particularly focuses on political parties, elections, and electoral integrity. Much of his most recent work examines current challenges in election administration. So welcome to you all. I'm looking forward very much to hearing your thoughts. Each of the speakers will make opening remarks, after which we'll have some discussion among the panel, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. Questions today will be gathered by Lisa James, whom you can also see on your screen. So if you have a question that you'd like to put to the panel, please write it in the Q&A function here on Zoom. Lisa will select a broad range of the questions and read them out. And if you'd like to ask a question anonymously, you can do that just by indicating so when you submit your question. And just let me note that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the Constitution Unit's website, on our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. So that's enough introduction from me. I will hand over straight to the first of our panelists, and that will be Laura. So Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. I'm just going to paste into the chat so that hopefully everyone can see that some of the headline changes that we have got for the elections this year. Some of those came in last year, some of them are brand new for the 2nd of May, but they're all new between the last parliamentary and whenever the next general election is. Something our members are very, very keen to know if they were able to get a summer holiday this year. So the administration of elections has changed so fundamentally in the last 25 years. That may have passed a lot of people by, because when you go to vote, you still wander down to your village hall or local school and you still put a cross on a piece of paper with a pencil. It doesn't seem very different. However, things in the background have changed. We have got a much more digital system in place now. So one of the changes to online absent voting that came in at the end of last year was you can now apply online for an absent vote. You can now register online since 2015 changes. There are a lot more citizen-focused services, which is fantastic. The issue that we often have, unfortunately, though, is that the back office processes haven't necessarily kept up to speed with other things that are going on. So we can explore that more throughout the next hour or so, but I just wanted to focus on 3 key changes that will be affecting us ahead of the parliamentary and for the polls that we have on the 2nd of May. So voter ID, that was the headline of the Election Act 2022, was that you would need to bring ID to vote. We had that on for the May polls last year, and we saw 13,795 electors try to vote in a polling station and be refused a ballot paper because they either didn't have the right ID or that they didn't bring it with them. That's 0.25%. It's a very, very small number, but it's an awful lot of work and a lot of media attention. Those polls last year, the turnout, we had around just under 8.5 million people vote last May, including the postal voters, about 5.5 million in polling stations. The turnout isn't comparable to a general election. So the impact of that went quite well last May. May wasn't too bad. We had a couple of police involvements of threatening behaviour, unfortunately, but generally it went quite smoothly. I don't think that this May will be very different. No offence to Police and Crime Commissioner elections, but they don't tend to drive turnout. So, but when we get to the general, we think it could be a much bigger problem. Another problem for the poor staff working in polling stations next Thursday is postal vote handling. So new for this year, if you receive your postal vote through the post from the returning officer and you pop it back into a nice red Royal Mail post box, there is no change. However, if you're one of these conscientious people who wants to save, a little bit of money for the local authority, cut down on some costs, and you decide to pop it through the letterbox at your council office, or you take it along to the polling station, you will have to fill in a form, a postal vote handling form, and it will check if you're a campaigner, because there are rules further restricting campaigners, but it will also check that you're not handing in more than 5 for each poll plus your own. So it's 2 sides of A4 that will have to be completed every time someone fills in a form. If you walk the dog of an evening and think, well, I'll just pop my postal vote through the letterbox at the council office, that ballot paper will have to be rejected. So we have already heard from our members that they have put up huge signs saying to people, do not put your postal vote here, but they are still getting postal votes put through letterboxes. These people in the next 3 months will have a letter telling them that their vote has been rejected. If we end up with a June general election, which is one of the current rumours, we'll try and get those letters out before that so they don't make the same mistake then. But we know that this is going to be a problem. The final electoral administration challenge that I'm going to just focus on is overseas voting. So from the 16th of January, the franchise was extended. So previously, if you were a UK citizen and you moved abroad, you could register to vote at parliamentary elections for 15 years. So they have now extended that to be an unlimited time period. Doesn't matter how long ago you left the UK. For people to register as overseas electors is complicated. The evidence that is required, the checking that is required is complicated and time consuming. We've heard reports of an average time to do some of the applications that were received on the sort of 16th, 17th, 18th of January is 2 hours, because people are having to find evidence, go back and forth with electors asking for more evidence. The volumes that we may see ahead of the general election mean that this could be crippling for electoral registration officers in council offices. Overseas electors can register to vote up until 12 working days before the poll. They can apply for a postal vote up until 11 working days before the poll. No one wants to disenfranchise these voters, but the time that there is to process the applications, and we have moved to event-led registration far more than we ever have before, means that we have got electoral registration officers worried that they will not be able to support voters as much as they would like, and heaven forbid some would end up being disenfranchised because they can't make the necessary checks in time. So all is looking rosy in the world of electoral administration at the minute, Alan, but we are hoping for great things in May and hopefully ahead of the general as well.
Wow, thank you so much, Laura. Wow, yes, much to get our teeth into there. Straight over to Paul.
Well, first and foremost, huge respect for election administrators who are the poor people who have to try to do something with what politicians give them. And that's really where I'm moving to, because I think there is a real problem this year in terms of democratic deficit. And I want to illustrate that in relation to the election next week of the police and crime commissioners. First, there are 8 million people who should be on the electoral register and aren't. Many of us have been arguing now for a long time, and I think that the chair of the Electoral Commission has now joined us in saying that we should move to automatic registration. A simple way to do that is with the allocation of the NIC. Secondly, as already been mentioned, when it comes to the general election, but even possibly in the local elections, there will be a lot of people who haven't got photo ID. The estimate is out of the total number on the register, it could be 3 or 4 million people that don't have ID. Jacob Rees-Mogg, you may remember when it didn't go so well for his party when he pushed this through, is described it as a gerrymander. Thirdly, and this is extremely important, the unilateral change from the supplementary vote to the first past the post for mayors and for police crime commissioners means that, of course, there'll be a very considerable reduction in the quality of people's votes. As things stood with the supplementary vote, almost everybody had their second vote taken into account, and that could be extremely important in having an impact on the result. There was no consultation, there was no cross-party agreement, and it was even introduced when the bill was halfway through its process through Parliament. So that was an extraordinary change to the system, and it was quite out with the normal process for all-party, cross-party agreement. And then, as has already been mentioned by Laura, next week, of course, we expect a reduced turnout for the local elections. Well, what's the effect of that? There's a certain amount of voter suppression there, but what is really much more important, of course, is that if in a situation like we have in Gloucestershire, there are 4 potential candidates who could win the police and crime commissioner vote, perhaps only 10%, 1 in 10 of those who should be voting are actually going to secure the election of that candidate. That is a ridiculous situation to be in, and far worse than we've had those particular elections before. Compare that with those who voted Scottish local authority elections with STV, a far more effective system, where 90 to 95% of those who use a second preference have a genuine say. Their vote counts. While in England, we might, in these elections next week, get up to something like 45% if we're lucky. So to the extent that this is a dress rehearsal for the general election, I'm anticipating a lot of questions next week as to whether the system is really working. No complaints about the poor administrators who suffer from the way in which politicians have imposed this upon us. If we get time later on, I'd like to turn to the extent to which this is a dress rehearsal for the general election, in particular in relation to the democratic deficit in terms of the weakening of integrity of constituency elections, which have been drawn to our attention by both the Electoral Commission and the Committee for Standards in Public Life. But I think that's best left for the discussion later. Thank you, Alan.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. Lots more to get our teeth into there. And last but not least, we have Alistair.
Thank you, Alan. I'll maybe touch on 1 or 2 things Laura and Paul have already said, but just to support what Paul said in hats off to election administrators. They really are the unsung heroes of the democratic process, and they've had a lot to deal with in recent years, as Laura's very eloquently set out. I've long suggested that we look at these questions through a public policy lens, think about the administration of elections as well. Unfortunately, these issues seldom attract attention, except when something goes wrong, and then hey, everybody's an expert. Fortunately, we're having this webinar now. There have been other things as well, which shows that people are starting to realise just how important this is. Okay, some various points from assorted research I've done. Some of this has been done in conjunction with Toby James at the University of East Anglia. First thing I would say is that not only have elections been in flux, they're also getting more expensive. And although it's very difficult to actually figure out how much administering elections actually costs, basically, we're on an upward trend there and beyond the rate of inflation, as far as I can gather. The government's not great at sharing data, as it's not with other areas as well, but they are getting more expensive. Our work, my work with Toby on polling station workers has shown very much that one of the biggest problems in polling stations is the electoral register. People turning up, not being registered, and poll workers, quite regularly experiencing cases of people being turned away. There's nothing else the polling station workers can do. That's the performing the role absolutely correctly here, but that suggests there's a greater appetite for participation if only we could get things such as the register right. Pre-election Act. I think it's worth putting one set of statistics out there from our polling station worker surveys, and that is that with polling station workers prior to the new Act, 2022 Act, there was already a degree of confusion about electoral law. In some of our surveys, anything between 15 to 19% were saying that election law was too complex to understand quickly and easily. And that came from general elections, local elections, and Scottish elections. So we tested that across different levels. Consistent finding was 15%-ish upwards, finding electoral law already too complex. Of course, we know what's happened with the Elections Act 2022. Election law has changed. Laura's already talked about some of the added complications that have come from that, handling postal ballots and so on. There's obviously more to it than voter identification, but we did carry out work on how voter identification went in last year's local elections. Let me raise some sorts of issues with you. The first is training of polling station workers. Now, overwhelmingly, this has moved online. When prior to the pandemic, this was very much conducted in person. Post-pandemic, it's conducted, well, by either recorded video presentations or online by webinars, the kind of thing we're doing right now. More than 80% in our survey last year's local elections had polling station workers trained in this way. Now, any academics who are listening into this will know how difficult it is to teach complex things online. So this suggests, there's an issue here, and I'll come back to that in a moment or two. Secondly, many of our respondents pointed out that it made elections more difficult to deal with than previous years. About 45% said elections were a lot or a bit more difficult to run, to work at during last year's local elections because of the Elections Act. Having said that, about the same proportion said that they were about the same. But we're still talking 45% saying that actually things had got more difficult. And we're also seeing in that survey, 60% of our polling station respondents saying that it took longer to process voters to begin with. Laura mentioned I think it's a number of about 13,700 being refused ballot papers when they got to the actual the desk. Unfortunately, what we found was that voters were overwhelmingly turned away before they got to the desk. Now that matters because it was getting to the desk that was crucial for them being recorded as being turned away. If they were being turned away before they got to the desk, we've no real record of how many people didn't vote because of voter identification. The Electoral Commission came up with an estimate. I would suspect that even that is still an underestimate. So we don't really have a sense of what the impact of voter identification is. The figures that were collected at polling station desks, I think, are useful to give us an indication. But 13,700 is still a lot, even if it's just 0.25%. There were more people affected. Now, to come back to the issue of training, we also asked in our surveys for some qualitative comments, and several respondents highlighted issues around training, about how the training was insufficient for them to understand what types of ID were to be accepted. That certain types of ID, it wasn't clear whether they could accept or not. That there was variation in practice as a consequence of this. So the training issue, I think, came through to us quite clearly in our qualitative questions in that survey as well. Now, obviously, a local election, as we've already heard from Laura and from Paul, nothing like a general election, nothing like the scale of challenge. This could well come back in a general election to make that very, very difficult to deal with in some places. I suspect problems may well be localized, but in some places it could well be difficult. One last thought about the role of parliaments and their oversight of this. By my calculation, there have been roughly, since about 2016, about 20 inquiries of some shape, form or another into election administration, into the electoral register or so on, in the Commons, in the Lords, in the Scottish Parliament and in the Senate. Now, the reports that are produced by these committees have been overwhelmingly good. The problem is, and certainly the problem at Westminster has been, that the government hasn't been listening to advice to try and improve the electoral systems. I have a different sense from Scotland and to a lesser extent Wales, but certainly in London, the government has not wanted to engage with critics. I think I'll leave it there on that happy note.
Thank you so much, Alistair. Gosh, we've got a great deal of material here. There are many, many issues relating to elections that we can explore. Remember, if you would like to put a question to the panel or any of the individual panelists, please do so. We'll be getting to those questions in a little bit. So you can put questions into the Q&A function on chat at the bottom of your screen, and we look forward to seeing what you come up with. Before we go to those questions, though, let me just pick up some points with the panel. And Laura, first of all, you might want to respond to some of the things that Alistair said, though, because of course you're both talking about quite similar areas. And I guess I was particularly struck. I had no idea at this point about training and training being online. And I was just kind of thinking, the job of a polling, I can't remember what the official title of them is now.
Presiding officers and poll clerks.
Thank you very much. The job is very much a hands-on job. You know, you're using your hands in order to do particular things, which you can't do in an online training session. So I'm interested to know your perspective on how that is working out, and then any other points that you want to pick up as well.
I should declare that our company we're training 67,000 presiding officers and poll clerks ahead of these elections. Not by webinars, we've got an online course, so it gives them the opportunity to answer questions, it gives them the opportunity to mark registers and to do a lot more things and complete ballot paper accounts. This is the bane of returning officers' life. Poll clerks and presiding officers being able to do some simple maths at the end of a 15-hour shift becomes very problematic for us. But I think our concern, so we used to provide online, we used to provide face-to-face training and online training after the pandemic, but we believe it is now so complicated that an in-person session only, you know, sort of turning up for an hour sat in a council office is too challenging for people. So we think that should supplement a lot of the factual information that's done online. So we find most people who are doing our training, they'll get their staff to do it online, the people working in the polling station, and then the presiding officers who are responsible in the polling stations, they'll come in for an additional briefing about key elements. And I completely understand Alistair's point about the types of ID. And I can't remember the exact statistics, but something like 90% of people just use a passport or a driving licence. And whilst we could cover 20 odd different types of ID in detail in training, our concern is it would end up confusing them more than it would assist them. Because I think one of our big worries, though, is how complicated that job is. So the point that Alistair made, there are over 40 forms that presiding officers need to be able to fill in a polling station, probably more for this year now we've got postal vote handling in the mix. More than 40, they do this job one day a year, and we're expecting them to understand 40 forms. We're expecting them to be able to ask statutory questions. I've just been doing some work. I'll post it for people's amusement. I shall post in the chat. This is one of the statutory questions that you may have to put to a voter in a polling station. Well, if someone can tell me what that means, I'd be very grateful. How we're going to find, you know, over 40,000 presiding officers and the electors being able to understand that type of thing is incredibly difficult. So the Association of Electoral Administrators, we believe that the government should start exploring the idea of voting hubs. So a lot of work that's been happening in Wales recently needs to have more work done by the UK government on it. To find 40,000 presiding officers is very difficult. Should we move away from having a polling station in each small parish, small village hall, or should we look more onto the, say, the COVID vaccine arrangements of let's have hubs where we can have highly trained, specialised people, and anyone can go anywhere. This is what the Welsh Government piloted a couple of years ago. There's a huge amount of things we could start doing with technology, but at the minute we have still been seeing the government introducing more paperwork, more form filling in, and not grasping the nettle of some of the wider, larger scale changes that are being explored in other nations.
Do you want to go into a little bit more detail on that? When you mentioned technology, the sorts of things that we could be doing, what kind of thing do you have in mind?
So in Wales, they had the idea of early voting, and they had, not all councils took it, it wasn't across the whole of Wales, these were pilots, so they were in small areas. But they had early voting where any voter could go to this building and they would use tablets so that they would record the electoral register online rather than in paper. And it didn't matter whether you were voting for parish A or parish Z, the ballot paper would be there. So at the moment, you have to go to your own polling station and you're only on the register at that one place. Whereas having voting hubs, you could have 20 polling stations worth of electors going to one big hub, which would cut down the costs. As Alistair says, costs, you know, run more than 100 million the general election will cost when we include candidate mailings as well. You know, it would cut down on costs. It would arguably give a much better voter experience. We are also supplemented with proxy voting and postal voting. So, you know, we saw almost half of the votes cast last year were cast online rather than in polling stations, or getting on 60-40 or something like that. People aren't voting in person as much anymore. Postal voting has changed that. So should we be looking at how we are delivering in-person voting now and how we could improve the situation going forward? You know, would it be better to be able to vote in Tesco's on a Saturday morning than having to wait until Thursday afternoon because it's slightly closer? Those sorts of conversations we think would be worth having.
I'm intrigued to hear Paul's and Alistair's thoughts on these potential innovations as well. Who wants to go first of the two of you? Alistair, you're already unmuted, so do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a need to zoom out here. No, I'd kind of go to Laura's very first point there. First of all, the numbers. Think of the numbers that Laura's just told us that have to be trained. 67,000, I think you said. You know, we're talking vast numbers, and I think this is one of the things that's underappreciated, is just how big a logistical challenge all of this in delivering election an election is. And it's made more complicated by a more macro issue, which is the fact that election law is just far too complex to begin with. And I see a question already popping up in the chat about this. The law commissions have put forward proposals to actually consolidate electoral law to try and make it simpler. And I think if we're going to come up with some form of action plan about what needs to be done, that really to some degree needs to be number one. There needs to be a lot more work done on consolidating electoral law. In terms of pilots, it's Scotland and Wales that are talking about this. The UK government, just as far as I can gather, aren't. In both the Senate and the Scottish Parliament have given evidence on this question recently, and it kind of gets bogged down in a bit of political point scoring, unfortunately. When I think my response in both places was that you can use this actually to help improve processes for voters and administrators as well. It's not just all about the political point scoring, and piloting things, trying things out is actually a way forward. Now, whether you want to vote in Tesco's, whether you want to vote by mobile phone, online, whatever it happens to be, I think is ultimately a policy question. But we don't know how these things work unless we actually try them to begin with. I think you need to think about the security issues and all of those things in this as well. But maybe for some pilots, I think dealing with administrative issues and trying to make things simpler for administrators. Laura's talked about hubs, things of that sort, I think would be a big step forward to trying to help run elections far more simply.
Interesting. Paul, you've seen this from very much the other side of the table, and I guess we sometimes see opposition from politicians to these kinds of reforms. Politicians are often, I think, more sort of attached to the kind of rituals of polling that have existed for centuries, and see those rituals as part of the kind of warp and weft of the nation's character and that kind of thing. What's your take on these issues?
Well, I think time forbids me to tell some tales from back elections that I've been involved in, well, a lot of them. And I just want to take up the general point that Alistair was making just now, that really in recent years, government, he said Westminster, I would say Whitehall, has not been listening to the people who are directly affected by this, including, of course, the election administrators. I mean, just an example of that. I was 30 years working in that extraordinary building, one end or the other. About 25 years of those, I was involved to some extent in legislation and looking at issues relating to the running of elections. And the last 5 years of that period, there was a deaf ear in Whitehall to the implications of what was happening. Before that, I, for example, was involved in a cross-party group that sat alongside the Election Commission and thought quite carefully about the implications of what Parliament was doing. It is something that has got appreciably worse in recent years. And I think it is a very important issue, as has already been said, that we should be looking again at trying to simplify the interchange between the major acts that affect elections. I mean, it's a ridiculous situation we have that the RPA 83 and the 2000 legislation are in completely different regulation systems. I mean, that is bad enough as itself, but I think we've got to find some way to get the Law Commission's advice on this implemented in the next Parliament. And this isn't actually just a sort of ANAREC issue. It affects the whole quality and integrity of our elections, if not just the electorate, the voters, but also the people administratively don't think the thing is working well.
Laura, the AEA has argued for reforms of this kind as well. What would be your priorities? What's most important here? I guess particularly if we're thinking about a government that is, coming in after the next election, has lots of different issues on its agenda, has limited time to focus on this. What's most important?
We used to want a consolidation of electoral law. Now we want a blank sheet of paper. We think it is too complex to consolidate, and actually we should be putting the voter first, the candidate first, and working out what we need for the system to work, you know, in 2024 and beyond. The big thing, if we were to get one thing else, we would like a longer electoral timetable. And we know that the government are not keen on this, and we understand their reasoning for it. But I fear that we don't manage electors' expectations very well. We don't give people time to make decisions about how they're going to vote, to know who is standing. So the general election, we are back now. We no longer have the Fixed Term Parliament Act. We are back to snap parliamentary elections, 25 working days notice. So 5 weeks. And that is from a standing start. So we're training 67,000 people this May. We're not training all of the staff. So we've got 40,000 polling stations for a general election. We'll have around 120,000 staff working. We have got to print 8.5–9 million postal voting packs. We've got to send out 46 million poll cards. We've got to print 46 million ballot papers. All of those sort of things. To do it in 5 weeks is an incredible challenge. When I first started working in elections 20 years ago, the electoral register was, if we look back 25 years ago, it was static. It was published once a year, and that was that. They then changed it so that it was updated monthly for 9 months of the year, and you had to be on the register before the notice of election went up to be able to vote. So you had to be on for the 1st of March for a May election. You now can register until 12 days before an election. So where our members used to be able to have registration put to bed and to focus on the election during the timetable, they can no longer do that. They are now running these two processes in parallel. We're also worried about the supplier market. So we have already seen for May some problems with postal voting problems. If you get very bored, Google, errors election 2024, and you'll see some of these stories. The printers, it's a very small supplier market, and they are under huge pressure. When you've got 8.5 million people wanting a postal vote, it is incredibly difficult. So we've already had to have the government agree to buying envelopes and paper and card, because the industry was saying from a standing start of 25 days, we couldn't get the card or the envelopes. It just would be impossible for us. They're the sorts of things that we have got to think about. Yes, I understand why there's benefits of having a shorter campaign period, but if a voter cannot get that ballot paper, particularly overseas with the extended franchise, if they're registering 12 days before and they want their ballot paper to be sent to Australia, the very best of luck to them getting it and getting it back to us in that time frame. We need to be realistic about what is achievable and manage electors' expectations.
Does this mean we ought to be thinking about more radical reforms about electronic voting, for example, at least for overseas electors? Because I mean, it sounds as though a lot of those, a lot of the need for time there is about the need to print things and post things. And if we could cut out that kind of process, would we be able to do this? I guess I'm also thinking about the average voter probably not really wanting even more election campaign time inflicted upon them than they're already going to get. So are there other solutions?
There absolutely are. The government did do some work on how, with the extension of the overseas franchise, how could we make sure these people could vote? The issue that we have is a lot of it to do with the constituency structure. So the overseas elector is registered at the last address they had in the UK, and they vote for the MP for that address. In other democracies, you will see overseas MPs, for example. So that would mean we would have 1 or maybe 2 different ballot papers that we could send to everyone living overseas. We have 650 different ballot papers. So one of the things we did quite a lot of work on is, could we have like a print at home so we could email them the ballot paper? The infrastructure is very difficult for 650 constituencies, around 380, 400 different returning officers to try and set that infrastructure up. Whereas if we said, actually, we'll have 2 overseas constituencies and the Electoral Commission will be responsible for those, then it would be more manageable. But again, regardless of what system was chosen, there is merit in having these discussions and finding time for the debate on them.
Do keep your questions coming in. We've had some, but there's definitely a space for some more. So if you've got some things and you think we haven't quite touched them yet, please do add them to the Q&A. But meanwhile, we will keep going among ourselves. Paul, length of campaign from a campaigner's point of view. I'm interested again in your perspective on these issues.
Well, I do think there's a point there that Laura's made that is actually a very strong point, because given the present situation, you can in fact have the declaration of an election, and then in a matter of days, postal voters are being encouraged to vote. So, you know, the whole thing has got compressed to an extraordinary extent. But I do think that what she's saying about overseas electors is extremely important. And if I may just go on for that one for a moment, because I think in the end, the government was persuaded to do this, not because it was going to be possible to get a lot more people voting, because actually, post-Brexit, they're not going to vote Conservative to a large extent. What they were actually interested in was extending the number of people who were eligible to make political donations, which is dramatically increased by this change in the overseas electorate, the franchise. And I think that's a very disturbing factor, because the actual way in which somebody is authenticated as a genuine, long since expat, if I can use that expression quickly, is actually very insubstantial. It's not very effective. It's not very reliable. And I think it's going to cause a lot of difficulty. So the fact that what we've done with the overseas electorate, which had a good case for extending it, is, I think, now going to be very much weakened by the actual practicalities of it. I think it's not just the Laura point, it is also that I think a lot of people are not going to be able to vote. But in the meantime, a lot of foreign cash is going to find its way into the political system here, which is not something I think that the electorate want.
And can we just stick with you, Paul, for a moment on the subject of campaign finance, because this is something that you write about in your book and that you have written about and talked about and emphasized the importance of a great deal over the last few years. It's perhaps more relevant to the general election than to the elections coming up next week. But do you want just to outline some of the concerns that you've got about the direction of travel there?
The Elections Act 22 has actually made it much more difficult for anybody, let alone the Electoral Commission or returning officers, to establish the extent to which money has been spent legitimately to support a particular candidate in a particular constituency. And we should just recall that we don't elect governments in this country. We don't elect prime ministers in this country. We elect individual members of parliament in individual constituencies. So if the integrity of a constituency campaign can be questioned by the amount of money that is being spent and is not transparent by the political parties in those key seats, then I'm afraid that weakens the whole integrity of our whole electorate and our whole election system. This is now really a serious issue because, of course, not just in terms of the clear case of the unincorporated associations, which can funnel money in from whatever source, foreign affairs, foreign companies, foreign governments, Russians, who knows, without anybody knowing where that money has come from. But it can actually be spent on a much bigger scale now than we've ever experienced before. The government has increased without consultation and without any agreement the amount of money that the National Party can spend in an election from 20 million, just under 20 million in 2019 to 36 million. And that increase is not going to be spread evenly, of course, across the country. It's going to be concentrated on the so-called target seats, the marginal seats. Given that at the same time that we don't know where the money's coming from because of the increase in the overseas franchise, I think we can assume that we're going to see a great deal more money from dubious sources being put into individual constituency campaigns. That is not going to give people more confidence in what is the outcome.
And if I understand correctly, part of the concern here is that we have quite low limits for the amount that can be spent in a constituency campaign, but in practice, a great deal of campaigning that is directed towards specific constituencies doesn't count towards those constituency limits because it's being done by the National Party and it's online activity that doesn't kind of have a trace within the constituency, and therefore potentially we have very large amounts of money swaying local results, which I mean, you're suggesting, I guess, that that is undermining the principles of the system where we have those low limits at constituency level.
Absolutely right. Since 1883, not 1983, we've had restrictions on the amount of money that can be spent in support of a candidate. And, you know, in the elections I fought, several of them, one was very careful to keep absolutely under that limit. It was not just had to be accounted for, but you could, if you went over that limit, based on the electorate, you could find yourself in election court. And under the system that the Supreme Court supported, it was still, that was very much the case. However, it's now, as a result of the Elections Act 22, it's going to be much less transparent as to what money those national parties are pouring into particular constituencies.
Yeah. Alistair, do you have thoughts on that?
I do, just not a huge amount, but I do have one measure, I think, which could help clean this area up a bit. Noting all Paul's points, which I think are very well made. Committee on Standards in Public Life put out in 2021 a report regulating election finance, and in that they had proposals for political parties actually to be subject to money laundering regulations as well. Political parties, believe it or not, are not subject to money laundering regulations for the donations they take. But at the same time, we expect charities, both at national and local level, to be applying money laundering regulations. Now, charities suffer from the same volunteer difficulties that political parties do, and indeed, perhaps even more so. The fact that we have two different types of voluntary organizations, charities, political parties, one subject to money laundering regulations, the other, which can lead to seats in power, not being subject to those, I think is an unsustainable anomaly. The likelihood of anything changing in that regard between now and a general election, I'm afraid, however, is absolutely zero. But I think that's one for the future to be taken forward. I know that peers have already tried to take this forward in the past, and it's certainly a recommendation that's there from CSPL already.
Laura, I'm not sure whether you want to get into these debates or not.
It's not something that we would involve ourselves with. Election administrators, we never care who wins an election as long as they win by a lot, so we don't have to recount.
Excellent. Can I ask you then one other question, and then we'll go to questions from the audience, which is just around how are you feeling about next week? So certainly a little while back, the AEA was expressing quite a lot of concern about whether it would be possible to be ready in a purely administrative sense for these elections, given all the changes and all the pressures on the system. How are you feeling about next week?
We're more confident than we were. We had real concerns about staffing. People struggled last year to staff for all of the reasons that we've talked about. You know, it's not a job that a lot of people want to do. It's a very responsible role and it's a very long day. Staffing seems to have gone well. Generally, things seem to be looking okay, but again, helped by some voter apathy, by, you know, turnout being low. I was very interested as well in Paul's opening comments as well about the electoral register. You know, electoral administrators would love to spend more time targeting under-registered groups, targeting people who should be registering. We saw Canvas reform introduced in 2019, 2020, and our members know that they've got issues now with registering attainers. So 16, 17-year-olds in England, 14, 15-year-olds in Wales and Scotland because of the different franchise for their polls there. But it is incredibly difficult with the public purse as it is, with the cost of elections and how much things have gone up. It is incredibly difficult to find the time and the resource to do the registration work that people would like. And again, looking at, you know, plans in some of the devolved nations is really interesting as to how much of that could go UK-wide to support getting people registered to vote. And then it's, in our opinion, for the politicians to motivate people to want to vote, be it introducing proportional representation or just actually giving people a reason to actually want to turn out because they believe that it's going to make a difference.
Very interesting. Thank you. Let's go to questions from the audience now. So Lisa will hopefully reappear. There we have Lisa, splendid. And I can see some more questions coming in right now, which is great. I think there might still be some room. So if you've not put a question in yet, do feel free. But Lisa, what do we have so far?
Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. So we're going to start with a group of 3. One from an attendee known only as MS, who asks, following up on Alan's point about electronic voting, could Laura and Paul comment on remote online voting or iVoting and where they see the balance of risks and costs on this as a future electoral innovation? And a related question from Anon. Are you worried about cybersecurity issues, targeted disinformation, bots, hacking, corporations and foreign countries with a stake in election outcomes? And then on a slightly different topic, John Cartledge asks, is it really necessary to have the count on the same day? At one time, the count in my area was held the next day at a school using the sixth formers as counting agents, an excellent hands-on introduction to elections generally.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for those. Shall we start in reverse order this time? So panelists, feel free to pick up anything that you would like to pick up. So Alistair, do you want to go first?
I've not got a huge amount to say about either of these things. I think cybersecurity is very clearly an issue, given that, you know, we've had the Electoral Commission hacked not so long ago. I think it's more broader than just those kinds of issues, though. I think the issue is more about misinformation, about potential online intimidation, those kinds of issues as well. So I think the idea of cybersecurity, I think, focuses very much, to my mind, on the administrative side of things, whereas those broader questions, I think, come in to affect the wider integrity of elections as well. And I think all elections, will suffer from that, but also are struggling to find an answer to it.
Interesting, thank you. Paul?
I'm very tempted to get into the counts issue. When I was first elected, it took 4 recounts. I ended up with a majority of 9 so far into the evening that the whole election coverage had ceased. The last news bulletin at 6 o'clock said, and there's another recount in Bodmin. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that people come a little bit fresh to the count process rather than they straight in after the poll closed. I agree very much with Alistair about misinformation being the serious issue I think that we're still not able to grapple with. On the issue of online voting, I've strongly viewed this as a prospect for a really good pilot for overseas franchise. I think we shouldn't have agreed to the overseas franchise without having a pilot for online voting. It's of course possible that the toing and froing between the potential elector and the electoral administration could all be speeded up by more online, but I think the actual vote online would probably be sensible only to be done as a pilot to see whether we can avoid the worst mistakes with it.
Laura?
Yeah, we're concerned about online voting, and I completely agree with Paul. I think if we were going to do anything, it would have to be piloted, but we also need to think about elections aren't just the first Thursday in May. They're not just for 650 MPs. Our members have elections every single week of the year. So we have parish council elections, we have neighbourhood planning referendums, we have a whole plethora of different polls that they are involved in. And I think we'd need to be very, very clear about how the infrastructure was going to be made in such a way that it could work across the board for the way we vote in the UK in all of these different elections. Cyber, in the last 6 months, we know of 5 electoral registration officers at different councils who have had cyber attacks. They have lost their electoral management system. Cyber is becoming a bigger and bigger concern. For those who don't know all of the background, but electoral management system is where the electoral register lives. It's where you can run all of the paperwork that you need for your polling stations, all of your data for poll cards and postal voting. If you lose that system in the run up to an election, there are very serious consequences. So it is being taken extremely seriously. But we are seeing, you know, as Alice said, the Commission had a major breach. 5 other areas that we know about have had them to varying extents. It is something that we have to be more and more alert to. And in terms of the count, we would love people not to have to count the same day. So for a parliamentary election, the law requires that you start counting the votes within 4 hours of the polls closing. I think that was the case since the 2010 general election. For local elections, we do see sometimes people verifying Thursday and counting Friday, or doing nothing at all until Friday. And we know this year we've certainly got some PCC polls that aren't being counted until Saturday. We didn't know when the general was going to be. So returning officers were having to make some decisions based on the fact that they might have a general, and getting big sports centres or arenas, as some of our members need, isn't necessarily straightforward. So they were working on worst case scenario. But I'm with Paul, you know, in terms of the media, a whole day on the Friday of the coverage is a wonderful thing, rather than trying to stay awake until 3-4 o'clock in the morning. But equally, I understand that candidates are very keen to know whether or not they've been successful.
Yeah, though I mean, many people have suggested that the whole process of elections and the formation of a new government could usefully be slowed down a little bit, and you know, perhaps we should be thinking in terms of a transition period, so that there's time for a new government to be set up, for Parliament to set up select committees before having to scrutinise government, all of this kind of thing. So yeah, perhaps it's part of a wider discussion about our obsession with speed in British politics. Alistair, you wanted to come back in.
I did just a very quick couple of things, and from the point of view of a count, if anyone's interested in slower counts, have a look at Northern Ireland and local elections with a single transferable vote, where that's all counted in person by hand, including transfers and so on, and can go on for days. One of the things that I used to quite enjoy when I worked in Northern Ireland, actually. But leaving that aside, in terms of the cyber issue, I think there's another aspect to this which Laura made me think of, which is with the election management software, there are also private contractors involved here. And I think this is an aspect of elections that's really not recognised, is the reliance on private sector firms to actually deliver this. Laura's already hinted at issues with printers as well. The Scottish Government, for instance, have an electronic counting system for their single transferable vote system. Again, this needs to be factored into these sorts of discussions as well. And I think we very often forget about the role of the private sector in delivery here.
Interesting. Lisa, back to you. Do you have another round for us?
I do indeed. So we'll start with a question from Patrick Side, who says, campaign rules, expenditure and personnel are pre-digital. But in today's digital age, individuals can participate rather than only official party nominees, and the legal restrictions are outdated. To what extent are administrators concerned at the outdated nature of campaign regulations? Next, a question from Anon, who opens up quite a big topic, asks, looking at polling of why non-voters didn't vote at local elections in 2023, that amounts to about 2.7% of the electorate who didn't vote due to voter ID requirements. If repeated at a UK general election, that would be around 1.25 million people, or the equivalent of 17 constituencies. People may want to pick up on maths here, but these are the figures that Anon has submitted. How much of a concern would that be? The UK government says we have a no-fail electoral system. Would that be a failed election? So I suppose that opens up the much bigger question of, you know, what is a successful election? How do we measure this? And finally, another anonymous question: do the panelists foresee any further changes to election regulations after the next general?
Fantastic questions. Thank you all for those. Paul, will we give you the chance to go first on this round?
Well, let's be honest. I don't don't think that most people in the political parties think this is a really important motivating issue for their voters. But this is the last question that I'm addressing first. If this next parliament produces real dissent about whether it's worked well, and they don't do anything about it, I think that this should be a very interesting question for the incoming government, because I think they might find themselves being an outgoing government quite quickly. If people are really dissatisfied with the way in which the election has happened, doesn't think that it has integrity at every level, then I think this will become a really important issue. And I have been spending some time, it won't surprise you, Ellen, to know, to try and persuade anybody who has any influence over who might be in the next government that they can't just forget these issues. They can't just think that it's not a doorstep issue, therefore not worry about it. Because if our election system has not got a reputation for being a really effective system, they could be in big trouble halfway through the next parliament. So I think, although the questioner is clearly a bit dubious about this, I hope people are going to recognize it is important. Just quickly to deal with the other two questions, I do think that there are serious problems that have not been properly identified because there hasn't been a sufficiently effective cross-party and non-party conversation with the people directly affected, the administrators. And I very much endorse what was said right up at front by what Laura was saying, and indeed we're all saying, that the conversations between the policy makers in Parliament and the policy drafters in Whitehall with those who actually have to make elections work and look and seem and be really effective has not been sufficient.
Alistair?
Hey, thanks. I agree with what Paul just said there. I'll pick up the question on the failed election. I don't think we've ever considered that at all. I'd be very surprised if the government had considered what a failed election might look like. But what I would expect to happen, I mean, obviously, that if that was the case, it would raise obvious legitimacy questions. But I think there is one example that we can look to in the not so distant United Kingdom that might give us a sense for what then goes on to happen. And that's what happened in 2007 in the Scottish Parliament election, where there were vast numbers of spoilt ballots in that particular election because they changed the order of the ballot paper for the parliamentary election. This got equated with the introduction of the single transferable vote for local elections, which was being run on the same day. It was nothing to do with that. It was to do with the fact that they actually changed the order of the ballot paper to put the regional list paper before the constituency paper, which confused many, many people. Vast numbers of spoiled ballots. I think there was something like 16 odd constituencies where the number of spoiled ballots was more than the majority, something of that magnitude. What then happened, however, was that election administration got taken very, very seriously. That there was an electoral management board set up to put in charge of consistency, something that I think has very clearly been something that's benefited the running of Scotland's elections. And indeed, the Scottish Parliament just at the moment have a bill in front of it to put that on a legal footing. So I would expect something of that sort to actually drive reform in a way that actually maybe a normal election wouldn't. And I'm back to my original point about when do people pay attention? Well, only when something goes wrong. If that happened here, I think that could be the driver for wider change, whereas a normal election maybe less so. That's not to say I want something to go wrong, however.
No, absolutely. Laura?
We regularly say that elections are run in spite of the legislation, not because of it. So we have over 2,000 members who regularly will not see their families for weeks on end. Once the general is called, you know, we've had members before who said, I didn't see my child for 6 weeks because they were asleep when I went to work and they were asleep when I came home from work. You know, we have a system where we have 650 constituencies to be returned, and some returning officers are responsible for more than one. But we don't have one person who is in charge, and no returning officer wants to be the returning officer who fails. So them and their staff work an astronomical amount of hours to make sure that poll is delivered. And linking all to this campaigning as well, since the advent of social media, everything is now in the spotlight. Alistair's point about private companies. So the mistakes that we have seen, very, very small mistakes with some postal voting issues this week, it is the council, it is the returning officer who is being blamed, even when they have done absolutely everything correctly and a private supplier made a mistake. And they've posted some postal votes that should never have been printed. But the media is now so quick to haul council officials over the coals for things that they cannot possibly keep control of themselves. The point about the amount of people that aren't going to register because of voter ID restrictions, the voter authority certificate was the government's way of getting ID to vote if you don't have any other form. It's an A4 piece of paper. It can last for 10 years. I can't find a letter that I was sent yesterday, let alone something that came 10 years ago. So, you know, we do question whether a digital solution needs to be found for that. Something like the COVID passes that we had that could be downloadable. You could keep it in your Apple wallet or whatever Android wallet you have available. But those sorts of things we think need to be considered. And in terms of changes after the next parliamentary, depending on who gets in, we would expect there to be a lot of change if some parties get in based on administrations in other nations in the UK. But whoever and whatever they're looking to do, we will continue to press that the current system is not fit for purpose and it is jeopardising electoral security and it is risking disenfranchising voters.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end of our time, but let me just ask, firstly, about one thing that several of you have mentioned over the course of our conversation, the idea of these elections next week as being a dress rehearsal for the general election taking place later in the year, probably later in the year. To what extent is that a true characterization of these elections? Laura, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I had a conversation with someone last week about whether this is a dress rehearsal. We're referring to it as a technical rehearsal. We don't believe that the volumes of registration of overseas electors, of absent voting requests, means that we are testing the system anywhere close to the volumes that we will see. The government has introduced an online, it's called an electoral registration officer portal. So it's a portal to process all of the online applications in. It was rolled out, we felt, before it had full functionality, and whilst they have been improving it in an iterative way as we go along, we are concerned about once we test it under stress. We've got members who are keeping 7 different spreadsheets because of the functionality not being there yet for all of the things they need. Something we haven't touched on that is one of our big concerns as well is that you now have to have identity verification to apply for an absent vote. So when you apply, you now have to give a national insurance number. We are seeing a lot of those applications coming back as having failed and having to do a lot of work to try to get that identity verified. Again, that's going to be a big challenge in a short space of time. Once the general election is announced, we expect to see huge volumes of people registering. So in 2019, when the general election was announced, we had 3.4 million people register to vote. If just 10% of those apply for postal votes as well, it risks overwhelming the system, unfortunately.
So your confidence that the system is ready for the elections next week does not translate into confidence that we're all fine for the general election as well? We
are very concerned for our members. We are a private company and we have rolled out free training for all of our members from the middle of May on wellbeing and resilience, and we pay for a telephone counselling service for all of them. It should not be necessary for a membership body to have to provide that level of support to people who are trying to do the very best job they can.
And final question to Paul and Alistair as well. So I asked Laura earlier about what Laura would prioritise in terms of reforms for the next Parliament. I didn't ask that question, I don't think, to Paul and Alistair. So do you want to tell us what your top picks would be in terms of how to reform electoral law in the next Parliament? Paul?
Well, first and foremost, the registration issue, as I think we're all agreeing. I think in day one in the next Parliament, we really do have to address this. And there does seem to be a relatively simple way of doing it, with attaching it to the national insurance contribution. But that won't be sufficient. I mean, the other issues that I think we've all been raising are going to get more and more serious through the next Parliament. And given the extraordinary way in which our electoral system does currently work, you know, the distortion can swing anyway. And I think we should all be aware of that, because if we have an unsatisfactory result in whatever later this year for the general election, because we're complacent as a result of next week, I very much think that any problems to come out next week will be magnified to a huge extent, as I think Laura is really warning us, in a general election situation. And then we think everything's okay, and then it isn't okay later in the year in the general election, and people are very dissatisfied with the way in which it's been run. And if nothing is done about that in the next Parliament, quick and early, because of other pressing issues, then I think we're in for big trouble in terms of the whole integrity and confidence in our system.
And Alistair?
I'm going to give you a top three, Alan. Party funding, consolidation of electoral law, and registration. Now, whatever order you want to put those in, I'll leave to others, but I think all of those are urgent issues that need dealt with.
And could you say just very quickly what you would do on party funding? We haven't really talked about that terribly much.
No, I've already mentioned this. I'd introduce the need for political parties to run donations through money laundering regulations.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, we are at the end of our time, but that has been an incredibly rich and illuminating conversation. Before I thank our speakers, just let me mention a few other things. Firstly, the recording for this seminar will appear on our YouTube channel and podcast feed in the coming days. Please do subscribe to those if you haven't done so already, or you can look out for information on Twitter as well. If you're not already signed up to our events mailing list, then please do that as well in order to be the first to hear about our forthcoming events. Just follow the Get Involved link on the Constitution Unit's website. And our next event will be a really fascinating one, exploring ideas for improving the processes of induction of new MPs, going back to what we were talking about earlier around transition periods following an election. So induction of new MPs, and we have a really stellar panel for that. We have the director of the Hansard Society, Ruth Fox, the director of the Institute for Government, Hannah White, the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, Daniel Greenberg, and former Conservative MP and Minister Alistair Burt. And you'll see that Ed, our administrator, has kindly just put a link into the chat so that you can follow up and sign up for that. It's taking place on the 5th of June at 1 p.m. So I look forward to seeing lots of you there for that. But in the meantime, thank you to all of you in the audience for attending today. Let me, on your behalf, thank our wonderful panel of speakers. You really have given us a huge amount to get to grips with over the past hour and a little bit. So many, many thanks to Laura Locke, to Paul Tyler, and to Alistair Clark. Thank you also to Lisa for fielding the questions, and Ed in the background for making sure that everything has run so smoothly. Good afternoon to all of you. Hope you all have a very good afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Bye-bye for now.